today's World Insight, China's bid to protect Beijing's historical central axis as a World Heritage Site. As a rising cosmopolitan capital, what are the ways to protect the ancient legacies alongside the ultra-modern skyline?
The basic idea of a central axis of the city actually can go back all the way to 3,000 years ago in the early Zhou dynasty.
And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. China will seek UNESCO World Heritage status for Beijing's historic central axis before the World Heritage Committee in 2024. Stretching nearly 8 kilometers, Beijing's central axis lies at the core of the ancient city, from Yongding Gate in the south to the bell and drum towers in the north. With 750 years of history, it is home to the Forbidden City, the Temple of Heaven, along with other historic buildings, relics, and cultural sites. In recent years, the Chinese capital has taken efforts to protect the area. As China's political center, Beijing also has great economic vitality and talent flow. The city embraces the mix of both the ancient and the modern. It is a vibrant cultural hub. So how can the city strive to be more cosmopolitan, to turn into an international metropolis, while at the same time, how can an irreplaceable window to Chinese architecture and tradition be better preserved? Let's loop in our panelists. For the fascinating stories related to Beijing's central axis, in Beijing we have Hanhua Media and Communication Consultant, also in Beijing David Moser, professor of the Capital Normal University, and in Beijing Matthew Hu, founder of the Courtyard Institute. Welcome to all of you. Since you're all living in Beijing, tell me more about which part of the so-called central axis is special to you. Matthew.
Well, I think as you introduced, I'm the founder of the Courtyard Institute, and our institute locates just on the central axis, I would say. Mm-hmm. Our institute is just 3 minutes walking from the east gate of the Jingshan Park, and we live a life just experiencing the central axis almost every day.
And you can see the Forbidden City just like that in the bird's view.
I can go up to the roof terrace and see the pavilion in the Jingshan Park.
So do the cats in the institute.
Well, she enjoys that better. Better view.
David, what about for you? You've been living in Beijing for decades.
Yes, well, of course, the most important part of the central axis for me in the past has been the Tiananmen Square part, because I always had to, had the pleasure of taking my students there and standing there and actually talking about the central axis there, because it's much easier to see it and sort of kind of get a vision of it. But I have to say, probably maybe a little bit more important is Gulou, the drum tower and the bell tower, which were very an essential part of the central axis during the Ming and Qing dynasties. So, but for foreigners and for my students, Gulou was the drum tower was the cool area with all the bars and nightlife and traditional culture. The Gulou was the fun spot that everyone went to.
Hua, what about for you?
I've been living in Beijing for many years. I came from Shanghai, so the very unique part that distinguish Beijing from Shanghai is the central axis. I have to say that, because Shanghai is more like a cosmopolitan, while Beijing is the combination of cosmopolitan and its very traditional culture and the landscape, which is represented by the central axis. So I've been living in the neighborhood of central axis for the past several years. So it gives me a lot of time and to visit like the Forbidden City, especially in the past years, because Forbidden City as well as the Jingshan Hill presents you a kind of tranquility during your busy schedule. And when I was a reporter, actually many years ago, I have to spend some time with the Great Hall of People, where the state leaders, when I was covering the international affairs, the state leaders met with the foreign leaders in the Great Hall of People. So that was also the part that I was kind of familiar with.
It seems that we can talk for a whole day about the central axis. It certainly is the best part of the city. But why is it so significant for understanding of traditional Chinese culture, for understanding of how Chinese aesthetics works, for understanding how Chinese governance, particularly during the so-called feudal dynasties, work? Matthew.
The basic idea of a central axis of the city actually can go back all the way to 3,000 years ago in the early Zhou dynasty, defined by the rights of the Zhou. And back then, I think the Zhou people took license from the Shang people, who were very corrupted, chaotic towards the end of the Shang dynasty. So they thought that to maintain peace and the stability is the top priority. So because of that, I think the Zhou people invented hierarchy system, and which is applied to all different aspects of our lives, not just political life, but also in terms of the built environment, in terms of the ranking system of the nobilities, even in terms of the measurements. So every aspect of social life has been defined by that, and obviously, the central axis of Beijing was defined by the Mongols in the early Yuan dynasty, although the central axis we'll talk about is not exactly the same central axis. But at the same time, it was basically following the same location of the Yuan dynasty central axis. But the person who designed it is not a Mongolian. He was a Han Chinese Confucius scholar, Liu Bingzhong, and his student Guo Shoujing. So these two gentlemen were the master minds behind this grand central axis. So that has developed into the 21st century, and we are still continuing that tradition by building the bird nest and the water cube just in the north, just as an extension of this central axis. So I think culturally, is quite significant. If you look around the world, I think that there are only a few cities in the world who have been designed very regularly, very systematically.
How these traditions are being handed down and how cities are looking their own uniqueness during this process as well.
I think that the Central Axis is a great place to teach Chinese culture, many aspects of Chinese culture. For example, the layout that Matthew just talked about, part of the issue there is the issue of feng shui, which has to do with the flow of qi through the city and through the buildings. And also, as we know, feng shui, which is a very complicated but a very intrinsic and very Chinese sort of value system and philosophical system, is embodied in the architecture of Beijing, the layout of Beijing, and also in the layout of other structures all through the city and in walled cities and in other places in China. So the idea is, one commonality, just to choose an example, is the fact that most of opening gates or most of the main gates and pathways have a south-facing direction. You can just stand there and point to all aspects of the architecture, the layout, the colors, the choices of shapes, etc., and link them to some aspect of Chinese philosophy, Chinese culture, even the notion of the valuing the center, the Zhongyong Zhidao, the valuing of the central way, you could say is metaphorically embodied in the centrality of the axis. The city was designed very much top down and with every detail in mind, and all reflecting aspects of Chinese worldview and philosophy. So it's a fascinating aspect of Chinese culture in general, but specifically of the Beijing North-South axis.
Yeah. Matthew, how do you see the issue? Rather a philosophical relationship between cultural conservation, heritage conservation, and also bringing dynamics to the city.
A very important part of the dynamic of the city of Beijing is its heritage. Culture came from a origin that already built and developed by our ancestors for centuries. Actually, we have 3 World Heritage along the central axis. We have the Temple of Heaven, we have the Palace Museum, we also have part of the Grand Canal. That is enough cultural attraction, heritage places for us to visit. I think blending the old and new is always a challenge. No one can claim to have the perfect solution to that, especially for a city like Beijing, because the entire city of old Beijing was designed with, I wouldn't say completely different, but rather unique in terms of the cultural essence as compared to modernity. So the underlying rules or principles were different. For example, our most of the buildings were built with wooden timbers and bricks, but all the modern buildings were made of concrete and steel, and that gave the city quite different scale. So that's from the practical aspect. So from the philosophical aspect, if you look at all the Chinese buildings, they are normally 1 floor, even though our the throne room, the throne hall, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, Taihe Dian, were so grand, but it's on a terrace. It's on an elevated terrace, but the emperor still directly still standing on the ground. But for any modern buildings, people were in apartments, so they are packed like pigeons. So that's a very different environment, a different arrangement. I think that the municipal government of Beijing were doing their best in the past few years to, on the one hand, doing very good archaeological research, to go to some sites, just dig into the ground to find some of the remains of the heritage. On the other hand, they were also trying to demolish a few outstanding taller buildings along the central axis. As far as I know, there's a market just south of the Homerqiao in Shichahai area had been demolished last year because of this effort. So they are making way to make the landscape. If you look from the Jingshan Park and from the top of the hill, looking north, your view will be much cleaner and nicer. But on the other hand, I think for modernity, I think the infrastructure has been improved. The road system, all the electricity, all the telecommunication infrastructure were improving. So I hope that modernity in this sense will not be too intruding along the central axis, just making way for the old to shine in the 21st century.
One has to remember there's always so-called old and new throughout history. What we consider as old was new at the time when it was built. So that's a very interesting question. It's about dynamics. What kinds of dynamics? David, as an observer, how do you see this question of cultural conservation and also bringing different dynamics and modernity of the time to the life and also to the planning?
Yes, Matthew is very right when he says that urban planning and balancing the old and the new is one of the biggest challenges of cities like Beijing that have a very strong and important cultural heritage. I think there was a time for some of us who cared and noticed these things and paid attention to them that we sort of feared that urban planners would, in the interest of building, more money-making structures and economically viable situations, would sort of tear down much of the old Beijing that we cherished so much. looking back and seeing how it has emerged now, I think the city government has done a very good job of maintaining the traditional structures and the basic outline and structure of the original city, with the modern subways, new roadways, and of course the taller buildings, that they've been managed to keep that balance very reasonable, so that if someone is interested in the traditional culture, the two are not totally separate, but they are both highlighted in separate ways, so as you can very clearly see the old and the new. And for example, I think Matthew and I have talked about this, I can't remember, but one surprising thing to some people is you think of Beijing as a very modern city, so everything is concrete roads and sort of high rises, and the old city are these hutong areas that are very different kinds of structures. But what you don't realize if you walk up Jinshan, as Matthew said, and look at the north-south axis, what's surprising, what you see is a sea of green. And what you see is that there's so many trees still on the north-south axis and in the Hutong area, that you realize that the city was planned in a way that really, from the outset, sort of carefully blended the human and nature aspects together in a harmonious symbiosis, sort of. So that the city of Beijing, the old city on the north-south axis, in addition to the structures and these grand palaces and so forth, they also didn't neglect the natural aspect, that they had left room for parks, for plants, for trees, and for green, ecologically centered kind of living lifestyles and city living. So I think even with the dynamism, the old and the new, Beijing has been able to retain things like this, aspects of the old city that have to do with the balance between, or the unity of humans and nature, as a big Confucian, an important Confucian concept of 天人合一, the unity of humans and nature is very evident as the Chinese philosophical system in the old city itself. So I think it was a challenge, but I think Beijing has done a pretty good job of retaining both.
Stay with us. We're going to continue our discussion about Beijing's central axis after this break. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Let's continue our conversation on the central axis of Beijing. With me, Hua, David, and Matthew. What's going to be the impact, or what has been the impact of this mixture for people's lives? I think that is the thing that really matters. Remember, Hua, we had been hearing about this debate starting from the start of People's Republic of China. At the time a new country is being built, what to do with the old, quote unquote, and how to do the so-called modern construction at the time. And that discussion has been handed down through generations, of course, different in nature from time to time, but certainly with the same urgency and same earnesty. Hua, how do you see that, the impact on people's lives?
You're right, Tianwei, as you just pointed out also that today's new is next generation's old. Same here. When they regard it as new, but we saw it as already old. So how to manage the balance and how to keep the core value, I think is the most important. There were definitely lessons and debates learned from the past decades regarding whether the towers, the gate towers, should be demolished since the very beginning of the new China. So we are learning the lessons, and we are certainly doing better, I think. For example, before the Beijing Olympics, there was another debate regarding the bird nest, where it is built, whether there was a block of a temple, a local temple there. So developers, and had to work with historians, have to work with people from different agencies to figure out what is the best way to give the impact to have both our host of the Beijing Olympics as well as to have the minimum impact of the ordinary people's life, not only about their daily life, but also about their spiritual life from the very from the very traditional Chinese culture. So people are debating, but people are also acting towards the keeping the core principle, which is, as David also pointed out, 天人合一, or respect to the nature, and then also giving people, especially today's people, a modern life or a life that they deserve to have for the modern conditions for today.
Well, holding on to the traditional values, Matthew, there are also possibilities of embracing the new ones. We see that debate also from May the 4th movement at the very beginning of the 20th century in China. Now, many of our lives have been impacted by that debate, including the founding of the new People's Republic of China decades ago. So how do you see, that evolving so-called core values of Chinese culture, which also would have an impact on our aesthetics and on our ways of what to preserve, what to leave in our culture, including with the central axis?
Well, I think I'm sure everybody agrees that the society is like an organism, so we are always evolving as we proceed into the new era. But I also believe that there's always some core values or ethos or heritage that can't be really abandoned and left behind because we thought at one time they were outdated. So I think that as you pointed out, the Central Axis also played important roles after the imperial era during the Republican period, have the new culture movement, and then followed by the May 4th movement, which is a very important political movement that shaped really the republic we have today. So I think in that sense, history or all the historical figures, our forefathers, were also just growing and developing their thoughts with the development of the entire society. But at the same time, they are also sticking to some of the fundamental principles.
That's a lot of responsibility, as we know. Hua.
Oh, yes. Well, what is interesting is that when you speak of a Great War or a Great Hall of People, for example, you think that represents China. But when you speak of Central Axis, it's more of a Beijing people's unique and treasure. So when you speak of old and new, I think the right judge in the first place probably will be the Beijing people. Yes, people chase for their self-convenience and their own interests. That is totally right. For example, when you live in the vicinity of the Central Axis area, you have to kind of sacrifice the the daily life convenience. For example, for those people living in Hutong area, sometimes they have to go to the public toilet. Even until today. So that kind of people maybe want to move to to enjoy the urbanization, to move to a studio or apartment, to enjoy a modern life. So down the road, I think there will be a lot of debate and discussions regarding how to maintain an individual's modern life, but at the same time pay respect to the city, to the homeland where you are living, especially when this homeland is enriching in its rich culture, a long history, as well as the combination of modernization and the keeping the traditional culture.
Right. Finally, before we go, if you got the opportunity to talk to those from different entities that are making their decisions on whether the Central Axis of Beijing will become a World Heritage, what would you say, one or two adjectives to describe what you know about the Central Axis? Let's start with David.
I would call it maybe a core representation of Chinese culture and philosophy. That makes it very worth preserving.
Yeah, Hua?
I would say it is a compelling Chinese story, or especially a Beijing story. Following the Beijing Olympics, Beijing Central Axis is waiting for you to explore.
The Central Axis is a living organism. So it's alive. There are still 500,000 people living alongside the Central Axis. So I think that keeping the Central Axis alive and dynamic is perhaps the most important challenge.
Matthew, David, Hua, thank you so much. I hope you enjoy your life in Beijing, and also let's go to explore some of the areas of Central Axis from time to time. Thank you so much for joining us. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.